Tuesday's attack on the segments of society who don't agree with their beliefs. These are liberal civil liberties groups, feminists, gays, lesbians, and pro-choice women. These people, they say, have turned God's anger against America. Quote, God continues to lift the curtain and allow the enemies of America to give us probably what we deserve. You'd hope that such talk would vanish in a week when sectarian hatred wreaks so much death and destruction in the name of religion.
Kate O'Byrne.
They're a disgrace, Margaret. Mayor Rudy Giuliani has performed splendidly during the awful hours since Tuesday morning. The man who was born to be New York's mayor has comforted and inspired all Americans. The outrage? Term limits that prohibit this urban statesman from seeking another term. New Yorkers who realize this week that Rudy is irreplaceable should be free to keep him in office.
Al Hunt.
Mark, late this week, Bush administration intelligence briefings to Congress were virtually meaningless. Members said they got more watching CNN. Now, if the administration thinks there's a problem with leaks, and there may well be, they should punish the specific congressional offender. But if we're in a war, it's not the executive branch war. Congress better be an equal partner or there will be hell to pay.
That's all for the Capitol Gang. Ahead, more coverage of America's new war. Thank you.
This is a CNN special report. America's new war. Resolve and remembrance. Calling on those in uniform to get ready, President Bush says flatly, America is at war.
And we will do whatever it takes to smoke them out and get them running, and we'll get them.
But is there a military solution? We'll hear from our correspondents. We'll speak live with former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. And we'll be joined by Jeff Greenfield. Why adversaries underestimate the United States. As America begins burying its dead. A father's frantic search for his missing daughter. And we'll take you to New York's Ground Zero for a look at rescue crews searching for signs of life and what they're up against. Who did it? The worldwide investigation. And we'll hear how some hijackers learned to fly right here in the U.S. And we'll speak live with the man who ran their flight school.
Good evening, I'm Wolf Blitzer reporting tonight from Washington.
And I'm Greta Van Susteren.
Over the next hour, we will look closely at America's military options. What will and will not work to take care of the terrorists who caused Tuesday's deadly destruction.
And we'll look at the state of the investigation. We'll follow the trail left by the hijackers and their accomplices.
But first, let's update the developments at this hour. Meeting this morning with his national security team, President Bush said the terror attacks will not stand. He called Osama bin Laden the prime suspect and said America is in a war which it will win. With security concerns high across the country in the wake of the attacks, troops were on the scene tonight outside the Pentagon to aid in the efforts to remove a suspicious package. The investigation into Tuesday's deadly attacks continues with an arrest warrant issued for a second material witness. And even as New York begins laying the first victims to rest, officials say hope is alive. Rescue crews continue their desperate search in the rubble of the Twin Towers, where close to 5,000 people are still missing. After tests of communications links, the chairman of the New York Stock Exchange says all systems are go for Monday's reopening of both the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ. Police, fire, and emergency representatives will ring the opening bell. 2 of the 4 flights that were hijacked Tuesday originated at Boston's Logan Airport. Amid heightened security and jangled nerves, Logan reopened today, but Washington's Reagan National Airport remains closed. Airlines are being allowed to remove stranded planes, but there's no word on when or if the airport, which is near the Pentagon and the White House, will be back in business. The airline business is hurting badly. Continental today furloughed 12,000 workers while urging Congress to help keep the industry going in the wake of the terror attacks. Continental's chairman says the industry is losing up to $300 million a day. President Bush says the United States is at war and vows to track down those responsible for this week's devastating terror attacks. Officials are not ruling out the use of ground troops. Let's go live now to the Pentagon and CNN's military affairs correspondent, Jamie McIntyre, for the latest. Jamie?
Well, Wolf, those were the words, "We're at war," from President Bush today up at Camp David, where he met with his national security team to plot strategy, their next move. Bush seemed to be preparing the United States public for a sweeping and sustained military campaign. These were some of his strongest words since the Tuesday attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and he seemed to be preparing Americans for what could be a long campaign against those responsible for the deadly attacks.
They will try to hide. They will try to avoid the United States and our allies. But we're not going to let them. They run to the hills. They find holes to get in. And we will do whatever it takes to smoke them out and get them running, and we'll get them. And listen, this is a great nation. We're kind people. None of us could have envisioned the barbaric acts of these terrorists. But they have stirred up the might of the American people. And we're going to get them for however long it takes.
The United States seemed to be also moving closer to naming Osama bin Laden as the person responsible for these. Again, President Bush calling him simply the prime suspect. At that Camp David session, he was flanked by both Vice President Dick Cheney and Secretary of State Colin Powell.
What we have to do is not just go after these perpetrators and those who gave them haven, but the whole curse of terrorism that is upon the face of the earth. And this is a campaign that we have begun this week, and we will stick with it until we are successful.
And again, no one here is giving any indication of precisely what kind of military response may be in the offing. But again, White House spokesman Ari Fleischer saying today that he did not rule out the use of ground troops. Wolf?
Jamie, is there any indication from your sources over there or elsewhere in Washington about the nature of the specific military action the United States might be preparing for?
Well, they're playing it pretty close to the vest, Wolf, but you get the feeling here of a couple of things. One, from talking to people at the Pentagon, I have the feeling that nothing is imminent, certainly not in the next couple of days. And two, you get the feeling that when they're talking about this sustained campaign, they're not necessarily talking about military strikes day after day, but a long campaign of pressure that would be punctuated by perhaps aerial bombings and even perhaps the use of special forces on the ground to try to snatch or kill Osama bin Laden. The big thing that's changed here is the so-called zero casualty mentality. Before this, the Pentagon had to be sure that they were going to take almost no casualties in an operation. But now, with the number of casualties here in the United States mounting, public support will be behind the Pentagon, even if some of the troops lose their lives in the pursuit and the fight against terrorism. Wolf?
Jamie McIntyre at the Pentagon, thank you very much. He knows as much as anyone about long, bitter conflicts. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for his role in the Vietnam Accord, and he invented shuttle diplomacy in the Middle East. Joining us now from Kent, Connecticut, is the former Secretary of State, Dr. Henry Kissinger. Dr. Kissinger, welcome to our program. And let me just begin by asking you this. The United States had a bitter experience in a guerrilla war in Vietnam. The Soviets had a bitter experience in a guerrilla war in Afghanistan. What makes U.S. officials, perhaps even you, think the United States will have any better experience in Afghanistan than the Russians had?
This is a different kind of war. In Vietnam, we tried to control the territory and to preserve it from a communist attack. In Afghanistan, the Russians tried to conquer the whole territory. The purpose of whatever operations are being considered now is not to hold any territory, not to occupy any territory, but to get the terrorists on the run, as Secretary Powell said, and to keep them on the run and make it impossible for them to operate and to destroy them if we can.
So what is the best military and diplomatic step, if you will, that the United States can pursue right now?
I would make a distinction between two kinds of actions. One is retaliation against the perpetrators of this outrage. And when we have identified them, and I think we are clear enough that Osama bin Laden, whether he was behind this one or not, has been behind enough of them, that he's clearly an international terrorist. Second is to break up the networks that exist independent of Osama bin Laden around the world. For the first, once we have identified the target, we should go after it by means that the Pentagon can describe better than I can. For the second one, I think countries have to be put on notice that safe havens for terrorists will no longer be accepted by the United States. These terrorists cannot undertake the actions that we have experienced last week unless they have a base from which they operate, unless they have an organization, communications. It takes a long planning, and we cannot permit them the period of quiet in which they prepare and then they strike us. So I think we should declare a policy that safe havens will not be accepted, and that therefore governments run the risk, not just from the terrorists of whom they may be afraid, but of American and hopefully other countries' reaction. It shouldn't be only military. Countries that offer safe havens should be cut off from communications with other countries, if at all possible.
Well, is that the extent of it? You say that safe havens should not be tolerated. Should the United States go to war against these countries?
No, they shouldn't go technically to war, but the countries should be put on notice first that there will be severe penalties, that countries that tolerate terrorist bases on their soil hopefully will be cut off from all visas, from all financial transactions, and from all economic reactions. Secondly, we and our allies should reserve the right to strike militarily at these bases and at institutions that support these bases. That shouldn't be the first step, but it should be a step that is clearly available, because now that this outrage has been committed, we should not stop until the back of these terrorist networks has been broken.
Well, which leads me to my next question, Dr. Kissinger, the sensitive issue of assassination. The executive order on the books right now in the United States says this: no person employed by or acting on behalf of the United States government shall engage in or conspire to engage in assassination. We spoke about 10 days or so ago, before these terrorist attacks, about this issue in connection with the Israeli policy. That time you said, and I'm quoting you, it is the absolutely correct policy of the United States not to engage in assassination as an act of governmental policy. Is this an extraordinary circumstance, though, that has now developed?
I think as a basic policy, it is the correct policy of the United States. But we may have to review a number of the restrictions that have been put on intelligence services to prevent a repetition of what happened or anything like what has happened.
And I think you will agree.
But that is a very extreme step, which we should look at with extreme care.
But a lot of experts have pointed out, and you probably will agree, that even if Osama bin Laden, who may or may not have been responsible for these acts, were captured or killed, the problem would not necessarily be resolved.
I think it would be a terrible mistake if we became so obsessed with Osama bin Laden that we would be satisfied with the destruction of himself or of his own headquarters. This is now a wake-up call for a systematic attack on all terrorist groups of international reach.
Dr. Kissinger, I want you to listen to the very strong, powerful words uttered today by President Bush. Listen to this.
We're at war. There's been an act of war declared upon America by terrorists, and we will respond accordingly. And I appreciate very much the American people understanding that.
Do you have any fear that President Bush may be under too much pressure to respond quickly without a well-thought-out plan?
I'm not going to second-guess President Bush. I totally support what he has said. I think the American people should support him. I hope and expect that there will be a